and Martha is the timekeeper. This debate will be judged by a panel of 3 adjudicators, who are Miss Lowen, Miss E, and Miss Rio. The topic of this debate is that homeschooling is a quiet rebellion against traditional education. The affirmative team seated to my right is from Emmaus Christian College, and the negative team seated to my left is from Glenunga. The speaking time for this debate is 4 minutes, with a double bell at the end of your speaking time. A warning bell will ring once at 3 minutes. A continuous bell will ring 30 seconds after the final bell. Please switch off your mobile phones and other electronic devices. I declare this debate open. I call upon the first affirmative speaker, Mia.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that homeschooling is a quiet rebellion against traditional education. We, the affirmative team, strongly agree with this statement. The topic refers to families choosing to educate their children outside the standard school system. Homeschooling is learning outside of regular schools, where parents or tutors teach students at home in a flexible and personalised way. A quiet rebellion is a subtle but powerful act of resisting or standing apart from the mainstream without being loud or disruptive. Being against something means choosing an alternative or standing in contrast to it, and traditional education is a formal system where students attend structured classes under teachers' guidance. In our opinion, homeschooling represents a quiet rebellion because it challenges the conventional structure of education, showing families willing to step outside normal rules and control how learning happens. Tonight, I will be talking to you about how homeschooling often lacks trained teachers or expertise in every subject, and how some parents choose it because they disagree with certain values that schools teach. The second speaker will talk to you about age-based grouping and the school environment, and our third speaker will rebut and sum up our team case. My first point is a lack of trained teachers or subject expertise in homeschooling. In Australia, parents aren't required to have formal teaching qualifications to homeschool, which can lead to inconsistencies in what and how children are taught. According to the Victorian Registration and Qualifications Authority, parents must develop a learning plan and ensure the child meets the educational requirements. Without professional training, gaps can appear, especially in specialised subjects. Moreover, while homeschooling numbers in Australia have surged, now exceeding 45,000 students, the rapid growth raises concerns about whether parents can effectively teach advanced subjects. A teacher on Our Australian Teachers shared that even highly educated parents often struggle with curriculum design and content delivery in higher grades. This lack of professional expertise becomes even more critical as fewer external assessments like NAPLAN are used to track progress. The Australian teacher workforce data highlights the importance of formal teacher education in delivering quality learning outcomes. As the report states, teachers are the #1 in-school influence on student outcomes, showing that trained educators are essential for ensuring effective and consistent learning. Furthermore, according to Education Daily, homeschooling often lacks standardised assessments like NAPLAN, which are used to measure student progress and ensure educational standards. In most cases, parents can choose whether or not their child participates in NAPLAN, which means there's no guaranteed way to track learning outcomes across all homeschooled students. This absence of testing can result in a lack of objective evaluation and make it harder to compare learning outcomes across students. In summary, the lack of formal qualifications across and standardised assessments positions homeschooling as a quiet rebellion against traditional education, showing families are willing to break away from the conventional rules. My second point is parents homeschooling due to disagreement with certain values. Some parents oppose to certain topics taught in school, including religious teachings or other curriculum content. According to Harding and Cooper, parents often homeschool to provide education aligned with their family's beliefs, allowing them to teach their children in a way that is consistent with their values. A report by Corey Emmaus states that in Queensland, 18% of parents cited opposition to schools' philosophies, including concerns over wokeism, as a reason for homeschooling. This shows that some families actively resist the mainstream curriculum in order to maintain control over what their children learn. In summary, Homeschooling in this context acts as a quiet rebellion because parents deliberately step outside the conventional system to ensure their child learns according to their family values. So in conclusion, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, homeschooling is a quiet rebellion against traditional education. It defies usual rules, quietly dismisses the authority of trained teachers, and allows parents to reject certain school values. Homeschooling quietly proves that families are willing to defy the system to follow their own path. Thank you.
I call upon the first negative speaker, Akshita.
To rebel is to say no. Homeschooling says yes. Yes to learning, yes to flexibility, yes to well-being. Good evening, Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that homeschooling is a quiet rebellion against traditional education. We, the negative team, strongly and unconditionally believe that this topic is false. We agree with the definition presented by the affirmative team. In other words, the topic of tonight's debate establishes that the practice of educating children at home is a subtle resistance against conventional learning. However, we, the negative team, firmly believe that homeschooling is not a quiet rebellion against traditional education. As the first speaker, I will argue that homeschooling is not a rebellion, but a response to practical necessity and individual needs. Our second speaker will explain that it mirrors the same fundamental principles as traditional schooling, proving it's an alternative, not academic or legal defiance. Our third speaker will rebut and sum up our team's case. I will now rebut the affirmative team. The first affirmative speaker argued that there is a lack of teacher training. However, this overlooks the reality of the situation. Many homeschooling families in Australia use structured programs, online courses, and even hire tutors to meet educational standards. According to the National Home Education Research Institute, homeschoolers rely on expert design curricula and support networks not to reject education but to personalize it. So the issue is not a lack of quality, just a different method, not a rebellion. Now, to my first point. What makes something a rebellion is the reasons why you choose to do it. Rebellion is about taking a stand against something, rejecting its values, or trying to send a message. Homeschooling is none of that. For many families, it isn't about making a statement, it is about meeting essential needs. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, a third of the population lives outside major cities, meaning school often requires hours of travel. For them, homeschooling isn't a protest, it is a necessity, the only option. Others choose it because their children don't thrive in mainstream schools due to bullying, anxiety, special learning needs, and more. A Queensland government survey revealed that 61% of homeschooled children had disabilities or health conditions such as autism, ADHD, or other cognitive challenges. Many of the families also cited bullying as a major reason for leaving traditional school. These families aren't rebelling, They are protecting their children and choosing the options that allows them to learn and grow safely. Now, to my second point. The phrase quiet rebellion implies that the people disagree with and speak out against the values and practices of traditional education. This is not the case. In Queensland, homeschooling registrations rose by nearly 47% in between 2019 and 2021, and by 2022, the number had doubled to over 10,000 as COVID gave these families an experience of homeschooling. Education researcher Dr. Rebecca English calls these families accidental homeschoolers. Clearly, they didn't reject school on principle. They had already been part of the system. What they found wasn't rebellion, but a better fit. Therefore, Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, homeschooling is not a quiet rebellion. Homeschooling is primarily a response to practical challenges. It reflects adaptation to individual circumstances rather than rebellion against traditional education. Homeschooling and traditional schooling are two different options which can coexist without taking anything away from or rebelling against each other. Thank you.
I call upon the second affirmative speaker, Leah.
Good evening, Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that homeschooling is a quiet rebellion against traditional education. We, the Affirmative team, are convinced beyond doubt that this statement is true. The first negative speaker has tried to tell you that customization isn't a rebellion. This is false. Even practical motivations are shaped by discontent with systemic limitations. If a child's needs aren't being met in school, whether due to mental health, learning style, or pace, it reveals the rigidity and failure of the system to accommodate diversity. That's a quiet form of rebellion. As the National Education Association states, many students struggle in traditional school environments because these systems often lacked the flexibility to address diverse learning needs, which leads families to seek alternative education options like homeschooling. This underscores that choosing homeschooling is merely a neutral option, but often a response to systemic shortcomings, a subtle but powerful rejection of a traditional school. Our first speaker has already talked about how there is an absence of educators in each field for homeschooling, and how many choose homeschooling as they contradict principles taught in the school system. Today, as the second speaker, I will be addressing two main aspects: the rigid practice of age-based grouping and the growing concerns toward the modern school environment. Our third speaker will rebut and sum up our team's case. My first point focuses on age-based grouping and how homeschooling challenges this traditional structure. In most schools, students are grouped strictly by age, assuming all children develop at the same pace. Homeschooling questions whether age should determine how, what, or when a child learns. As Emily Taylor writes on Medium, homeschooling isn't just an alternative, it's a rebellion against a broken system. Traditional education often forces children into standardized paths that ignore individual needs, while homeschooling allows children to learn alongside siblings, mentors, or community members of all ages, mirroring real life more accurately than a classroom. Raymond Moore, a pioneer in homeschooling research, explained that homeschoolers benefit from more of family and less of school, more of parents and less of peers, more creative freedom and less formal lessons. Homeschooling therefore rebels not only a rigid structure, but also against the idea that children must be shaped only by same-age peers. So in short, homeschooling is a quiet but clear rebellion that rejects the one-size-fits-all timeline. Now to my second point, homeschooling also rebels against the school environment. The modern school system, as Quartz Note states, was designed over 200 years ago during the Industrial Revolution to train factory workers to follow instructions, show up on time, and obey authority. Society has changed, yet classrooms remain overcrowded and often unsafe, exposing children to bullying, drugs, peer pressure, and other risks. Former Principal Paul Kitson, with over a decade of experience, even described last year as the worst school year for school violence since 2011. These issues concern parents who now seek safer, more controlled learning environments. According to the Institute of Education Sciences, 80% of parents homeschool because of worries about the school environment. Choosing homeschooling is not an avoidance, it is a deliberate and purposeful rejection of an outdated system. So in conclusion, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, because of the rigid practice of age-based grouping and the growing concerns toward the modern school environment, homeschooling stands as a clear rebellion against traditional education. Thank you.
I call upon the second negative speaker, Aditi.
Good evening, Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that homeschooling is a quiet rebellion against traditional education. We, the negative team, unwaveringly disagree with this statement. I will now rebut the affirmative team. The first affirmative speaker has argued that parents get full control over the child's education. But this point is flawed because, as I will explain, home education is thoroughly governed and standardized, and the homeschooled child's education is not completely taken over by their parents. The South Australian government states that homeschooled children need to follow an education program that meets the goals of the Australian curriculum or similar. This proves that the affirmative team's point is false because parents are not able to just teach their child whatever they like, which rebels against traditional education without following the curriculum. The affirmative team has also argued that homeschooling challenges the established norms of what education should look like, quietly rebelling against a conventional school system. Yet this interpretation overlooks that homeschooling is often about adapting education to better fit individual needs, not rejecting the system itself. Many families choose homeschooling to provide a more personalized and flexible learning environment. This is less about rebellion and more about finding effective solutions within the broader education framework. Research from the Australian Home Education Advisory Service shows that homeschooling supports diverse learning styles and often complements mainstream education goals rather than opposing them. Therefore, homeschooling questions educational norms by offering alternative methods, but it does not represent a quiet rebellion. It is a pragmatic choice. Our first speaker, Ikshitha, has already explained to you why homeschooling isn't a rebellion because it's chosen due to individual needs and preferences, not because traditional education is disagreed upon. Today, I will inform you about how homeschooling shares the same values with traditional education and is standardized and governed. Now to my first point, that homeschooling shares the same values as traditional schooling and therefore is not a rebellion. As our first speaker explained, it is a more flexible option to suit different families and situations. However, it still has the same core purpose as traditional education of teaching crucial life skills and academics. The timeline may look different, but students still undertake classes, practice reading, writing, maths, and science, and have opportunities to explore their world. According to the Guide to Home Education in South Australia, homeschool children still socialise in many of the ways traditional scholars do, as they are required to participate in extracurricular activities, community events, and are highly encouraged to participate in homeschool groups, online and in person. Since homeschooling achieves the same result as traditional education in many of the same core ways, how is it a rebellion? Now to my second point, that homeschooling is very much governed and standardised. According to the South Australian Government, parents must acknowledge their responsibilities to provide evidence of a planned education program that meets the goals of the Australian curriculum or similar, including appropriate resources and learning environments, as well as opportunities for the child's social interaction. This proves that although homeschooled children may progress at different paces and or in a different structure, they are legally required to follow a very similar educational path to traditional education. Homeschooling isn't a rebellion if it operates within the same framework and standards of traditional schooling. If the system allows this choice, is it a rebellion at all? Therefore, homeschooling is not a rebellion against traditional schooling. So, Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, homeschooling thrives with the same values as traditional education and is thoroughly standardised and regulated. This proves the topic that homeschooling is a quiet rebellion against traditional education to be unquestionably false. Rebellion requires opposition. If homeschooling follows the law and curriculum, can it truly oppose anything? Thank you.
I call upon the third affirmative speaker, Cara.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that homeschooling is a quiet rebellion against traditional education. We, the affirmative team, strongly and confidently believe that this statement is true. Today, as the third speaker, I will rebut the negative team and sum up my team's case. Now to my rebuttals. The first negative speaker has made a flaw in her argument. She has said that rebellion is making a statement, but we, the affirmative team, have already defined the topic and rebellion as standing apart something, not standing like making a statement. The negative team has also agreed to this definition, except they go against it a few sentences later. The first negative speaker has also tried to tell you that parents aren't rebelling against the system, they're just customising their child's education process. But while it's true that many families choose homeschooling out of necessity, that doesn't mean their decision is neutral. In fact, homeschooling in response to a system that consistently fails to meet children's needs is a subtle but powerful form of resistance. It's a deliberate step away from conventional structures, and one that quietly challenges the idea that the state or school system knows what's best for every child. Parents of children with special needs often turn to homeschooling not because it's their first choice, but because traditional schools fail to provide adequate support. The Guardian says that more English parents are turning to home education due to inadequate support from schools, particularly for those with special educational needs. This isn't just a personal adjustment, it's a quiet rejection of institutions that claim to serve all children but fail short. Even when driven by necessity, homeschooling becomes a subtle act of resistance, a quiet rebellion against a system that too often fails to adapt. The second negative speaker has tried to tell you that students in homeschooling are still learning the same curriculum as students in traditional schools. But even when homeschoolers learn the same, schools or government learn the same as schools or government programs, they are still staying independent by operating outside of the main system. They usually choose which services to use and which to avoid. The way of homeschooling pushes boundaries instead of just fitting in. According to K-12, homeschooling families often customise their education experience by mixing different resources, choosing what fits their child best rather than following one set path. This shows that homeschoolers remain independent by choosing what works for them, showing that homeschooling pushes boundaries rather than just fitting in. I will now sum up my team's case. The first affirmative speaker has already shown how homeschooling enables parents to break away from the rigid systems of traditional schooling, quietly rebelling against its structure, routines, and standardised grading systems. She also discussed how homeschooling rebels against the content and values taught in schools. The second affirmative speaker has spoken about age-based grouping and how homeschooling is rebelling against its system. According to Education Week, homeschooling grants parents freedom from the routine learning that prevails in schools. The second affirmative speaker has also talked about how homeschooling says no to the sometimes negative environment of traditional schools. James Foreman Jr. says that actually creating a positive school climate, particularly in schools that are in communities that are themselves not calm and orderly, is hard work. Homeschooling is not just an alternative. It's a rebellion against teaching that doesn't fit the standards of everyone. So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, homeschooling represents a quiet rebellion against traditional education. I'd like to end with a quote. Oscar Wilde once said, "Disobedience, in the eyes of anyone who had read history, is man's original virtue. It is through disobedience that progress has been made, through disobedience and through rebellion." Thank you.
On the third negative speaker, Lorraine.
Good evening, Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that homeschooling is a quiet rebellion against traditional education. We, the negative team, completely and unquestionably believe that this topic is false. Tonight, as a third speaker, I rebut and sum up my team's case. The first affirmative speaker argued that there is a lack of professional expertise. However, this argument simplifies the reality of modern homeschooling. While parents may not always hold teacher credentials, many seek out expert guidance, use structured accredited curricula, and even enroll their children in online classes taught by certified teachers. According to the National Home Education Research Institute, a significant number of homeschooling families use educational resources designed by professionals, and many participate in co-ops or hybrid programs that provide access to qualified instructors. These families are not rejecting educational standards. They are adapting them to be better meet individual needs. Therefore, the lack of traditional teacher training does not make homeschooling a rebellion. It reflects a shift in delivery, not a rejection of educational quality or rigor. The second affirmative speaker argued that the lack of age grouping in school is a rebellion. However, this assumption is outdated and does not reflect how homeschooling works today. In reality, homeschooling families prioritize socialization through community services, sport clubs, group classes, co-ops, and volunteering. According to a report by the Home Education Association of Australia, homeschooled students often interact with a broader age range and engage in meaningful real-world social experiences, arguably more diverse than the structured setting of a traditional classroom. So rather than rejecting social development, homeschooling encourages it in a more flexible and even more enriching ways. This is not rebelling, it is a different and sometimes even more effective approach. The second affirmative speaker also tried to tell you that the different environment of homeschooling is a rebellion, but this is a flawed link. Just because something functions differently does not automatically mean that it is rebellion against what came before. Difference does not mean defiance. Many forms of education, such as Montessori, online learning, or even international schooling, operate differently from traditional models, but we do not automatically label them as acts of rebellion. A rebellion requires intentional resistance or rejection of the system. The vast majority of homeschooling parents choose this path not to rebel, to meet personal, practical, or educational needs. So, unless the affirmative team can show that these differences are deliberate acts of protest, not just alternative methods, they have not proven that homeschooling is a rebellion, quiet or otherwise. The third affirmative speaker argued that there is inconsistent curriculum coverage. However, this overlooks the fact that Australian homeschooling families are required to develop structured learning plans that align with the Australian curriculum or similar educational frameworks, ensuring comprehensive coverage. According to the research by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, most homeschooling families take careful steps to follow approved curricula and regularly assess their children's progress to meet educational standards. This shows that homeschooling is not about skipping or avoiding parts of curriculum. It is about delivering it in a tailored and flexible way. Our first speaker has established that the intent behind a quiet rebellion depends on individual motivation, and that homeschooling does not qualify as a rebellion, but rather serves as an alternative to traditional education. Our second speaker has reinforced this by showing that homeschooling upholds the same core values and educational objective as traditional schooling, and that following the same exact path does not mean a legal or academic rebellion. So, Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, this shows that tonight's topic, that homeschooling is a quiet rebellion against traditional education, is undeniably and completely false. Homeschooling is a personal choice, not an act of rebellion. It exists as a legitimate alternative to traditional education, sharing the same core values, goals, and educational pathways. Homeschooling is not a quiet rebellion, but a thoughtful alternative to traditional education. It does not reject the system, it reimagines it to better suit individual needs. At its core, homeschooling places the responsibility of learning in the hands of parents, and those who choose homeschooling are not resisting education, they are actively embracing their role in it. At its heart, homeschooling shares the same goal as traditional education, to educate and prepare children for the future. Thank you.